All right, so hello everyone, welcome. This is the first installment of our webinar series. The series is called, as I'm sure you're all aware by now, Document Detectives. And today the specific presentation is called The Sleeping Lion Awakens, Montana's Chinese and the Anti-American Boycott of 1905. So our guest presenter today is Mark Johnson. Before we begin, I've just got a couple notes of housekeeping. So the webinar will last about an hour. There will be about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box and we will get to them after the main presentation. If you would like, we'd love it if you would just say hi in the chat. Let us know where you're from, how you heard about this, any specific interest or extra information that you have. You know, just come say hi. I believe that is all that I have for housekeeping. Oh, no, one more. So the webinar is being recorded. It will be available on our website after the event. So if you want to watch it again or send it to friends or anything like that, it will be up and available. So we're going to start. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the museum at Fort Missoula is in the homelands of the Salish and Kalispel people. We offer our respect for their history and culture and for their wisdom in caring for this place for generations to come. I would also like to introduce our speaker for today. Mark Johnson is a fellow with the University of Notre Dame's Institute for Educational Initiatives. In this role, Mark works with the Alliance for Catholic Education, partnering with middle and high school social studies teachers who serve in under-resourced Catholic schools across the country. In his history interests, Mark focuses on the Chinese experience in his home state of Montana. Previously working in Shanghai, China, Mark brought students with the necessary language abilities to Montana to translate several collections of documents from the state's historic Chinese communities to work to tell the history of Montana's Chinese in their own words. And so he's going to be sharing some of that research with us today. And with that, Mark, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for the introduction. And I just want to thank Anne and Jesse for the hard work in planning this. I assume my audio is coming through okay, and I'll be sharing my screen and doing some polls and things like that with you throughout today's presentation. Just want to start by thanking the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula for leading interesting discussions about our region in this way. And as Anne mentioned, I work for the University of Notre Dame, but I live in Helena, Montana, originally from Great Falls, Montana, traveled the world a little bit before coming back to the Big Sky State, and have just really enjoyed trying to tell the history of Montana's Chinese communities in a couple of different ways. One, in their own words, through translated documents that are translated for the first time ever, that gives us the Chinese experience in their own voice and from their cultural perspective. And two, for the purposes today, more so from a global lens. So understanding the global context, the Chinese historical context in the sources that can hopefully help us understand this very important population for Montana's development and cultural diversity more fully. So I'm going to share the screen here. And I think that's coming through. You should see a couple of interesting images. I think they're interesting, at least. So the sleeping lion has awakened, Montana's Chinese and the global anti-American boycott of 1905. So these are some of the images that I've come across as I do the research. And this document detective series, I was interested when I heard that, because it's about finding interesting sources and then working to make sense of those sources. And I focus particularly on one source today that has received very little attention in scholarly discussions of the Chinese in the North American West. I know that the participants who are here today probably have some general knowledge about the Chinese experience in Montana. And so we'll just engage a little bit here with some questions on that. So when were they here? What was the population at its height? What occupations did they do? I'm going to try to launch a poll here, and you should be able to see some options for that. And so you should see poll question number 1. Is that launched at the moment? Relaunch that. Okay, there we go. When was Montana's Chinese population at its peak? You have the dates on the left, 1870 down through 1920. If you could go ahead We got some responding. Good. We get a sense that it's, you can see those responses, I think. We're getting 1890 as the predominant answer. And really, this is a difficult question to answer in two ways, because are we talking numerically when its population was at its peak, or was it the percentage of the overall territorial population? So actually, we'll answer this as we go along in a little bit. And let's see about the next poll question. At its height, Montana's Chinese population formed what percentage of Montana's total population? Don't stress too much about your answers. This only counts for 40% of your second semester grade here. Good, we're getting 56% of you have said less than 5%, 60% say less than 5%. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. I think you might be surprised by that. More than 20% said 1, okay. Let's go with another question here. I'll answer these as we go along too. Most Chinese in Montana work in what occupation? See, railroad work is the early leader. Mining's catching up a little bit. Laundries. Nobody's saying restaurant work. You haven't been to the Pekin Cafe in historic Butte, America, I guess. Okay, there we get some restaurant work coming in. Railroad work seems to be the leader. And of course, this can be more than one answer, because maybe you worked in railroad work for part of your working career here in Montana and then transitioned into laundries, which is indeed what often happen. But the leader here seems to be laundries and railroad work, and we'll answer those as we go along in a bit. Good, thank you for your engagement and interaction there. I think that's it for the polls at this moment. What we see here, let's see, I'm gonna stop sharing those. Okay. These are a photograph and a drawing from Montana's early pastime. And you do see on the bottom left, Chinese working in placer mining in the Virginia City area. Very much was, let's see, try to stop sharing those polls. Very much was the early draw for the Chinese coming to California, then into Nevada and up into Montana with those strikes of precious metals. So they definitely did work in placer mining. But by the early 1870s, they were largely pushed out of that in many ways. And as Montana mining economy transitioned to lode and underground mining, the Chinese were very rarely involved in underground mining. The railroad work was definitely a reason for many of them coming to the region, coming in the 1860s to work in the Central Pacific out of California, and then the Northern Pacific up into the early 1880s in Montana. Absolutely were part of the occupations. But as Montana transitioned into the late 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, the vast majority of the Chinese in the territory and the state worked in laundries, restaurants, worked as peddlers, worked in gardening, and things of that nature. So we often have one impression as we go into this study, and that can be countered a little bit with the sources. But even with these occupations, what I want to do today is go deeper to try and look at the Chinese experience from their own voice, to give them agency, to look at their own humanity, and to get past maybe overly generalized and stereotypical views of the Chinese in the North American West. What we can see through these sources that we're going to be doing a deep dive in today is that the Chinese workers in Montana were deeply interconnected with global events, both in terms of ripple effects of global events impacting them here in Montana, but also in pretty exciting ways, influencing national policy and even Chinese history and the trajectory that the Chinese state took in the late 19th and early 20th century. So they were active, involved, engaged, capable of great impact. Why did they come? We'll look at those ideas. How were they treated? How did they respond to that treatment, often ill treatment in the North American West? How can we know about their struggles, their lives, their goals? These are the key questions that I seek to try and answer in my work, and I'll be playing around with these ideas today in the presentation. And so we go to the sources. Again, this is the Document Detective series. What sources remain, and what do these sources allow us to assert about the Chinese experience in Montana. I think that's a key thing, and with my students, I stress that often. What do the sources allow you to assert? If you go in the other way around with your conclusions already made and then go find your sources, you're going to be cherry picking your sources, and it's not necessarily the most authentic and way infused with integrity to go about historical research. So do the collection of sources, analyze and interpret them, and then figure out what they allow you to assert. And so on that point, I want to have you think about questions, sources for a little bit. In your opinion, which source would provide the most useful information about the Chinese experience in Montana? Would that be a US governmental census report, non-Chinese, so white-controlled newspaper reports about the Chinese, letters from Chinese Montanans about their experiences, or possibly arrest and deportation proceedings against the state's Chinese? If you're a historian looking into this, what would you like to have? I see the vast majority of people said letters from Chinese Montanans about their experiences in the state. I think you're onto something. The experiences in their own words, from their perspective, from their voice. Sadly, as you might imagine, very few sources of this type remain. And I'll be honest, each of these sources has its benefits and its drawbacks. So of course, US governmental census reports can be an important way to learn about the state's demography, but has some drawbacks, as we'll see. Letters from the Chinese Montanans about their experiences, that is indeed an important primary source when they exist. But if you think about it, the letters from Montana's Chinese wouldn't be here in Montana. They'd be sent back to southern China. So any letters that we would get here in Montana would likely be from family members back in southern China, writing about their experiences in southern China to family members, usually men, working in the region. So there's benefits and drawbacks to each of these sources. Arrest and deportation proceedings, how did they run afoul of the law? What voice did they have in the judicial system? And then the newspaper, non-Chinese newspaper reports obviously will describe the Chinese in Montana, but from an outsider's perspective. So some benefits and drawbacks there. Okay. And so on that idea, we look at sourcing. As historians, we look at sourcing. Whose perspective is included in that source? Whose is left out? What's the source's origin? Why was it created? What's its life as a source? And then we work to contextualize that source. So understand the source in its Montana context, what else is going on in the state at the time, in the broader American context, and for the purposes of my research, in the Chinese historical context. I was fortunate to spend 8 years in Shanghai and got to understand Chinese history pretty thoroughly, and then began to look at Montana's Chinese experience through a Chinese historical lens. And then sometimes the sources don't say things, maybe leave some silences, and you can read those silences to interpret and try to analyze what those sources tell us. And so I'm excited to be part of this, document detectives. Where can we find the sources, and what do they tell us? Chris Merritt, who wrote a very good archaeological book about the Chinese experience in Montana called The Coming Man from Canton. He's a graduate of the University of Montana at Missoula. And he rightly states that the Chinese residents in Montana are nearly impossible to track individually. Well, that makes things somewhat difficult, right? And the question is, why is this? Obvious language barriers, cultural barriers. But that first source that I mentioned for the US government census reports might seem to give us some information. Here's the Montana territorial, of course, Montana wasn't a state in 1870, but the territorial census, a snapshot from Helena, Montana, from the territorial census of 1870. And you can see the point as to why Chris Merritt says that the Chinese residents in Montana are nearly impossible to track individually. It does give age, it does give gender, it does give occupation, but because of language barriers, the actual identity of these individual Chinese residents of the territory is clouded. So we have China man, China woman, China boy, China woman. And so finding and tracking and digging deeper into that individual person is very, very difficult. 1880 possibly gets better. Maybe the 1880 census allows us to track those individuals with more specificity and depth. And so here's a grainy snapshot from the 1880 census. And again, we have occupation, we have the race, their C, we have gender, we have age, and it seems like we have name. Wuk, Yak, Liang, Qi, but this is a little bit misleading. In this 1880 census, was used as part of the name for 44% of the Chinese residents of Helena. Okay, so you might think, well, maybe if they're from the same clan, same district, same family group. Not necessarily. In 1905, there was a special census taken that I'll talk about in depth today, and it had the benefit of having a Chinese translator along with the government agent. And as that Chinese translator knew the Chinese languages with which he interacted, what that Chinese special census of 1905 showed us is that was part of the name for only 5% of Montana's Chinese. What we know, culturally speaking, is that isn't often a family name or a given name, but it's a diminutive expression of familiarity. And so the Chinese back and forth within their own community might have referred to each other as this, that, but it's not the family name. Census takers mistook it for being the actual formal name, and it comes down to us in these official government documents seeming to give identity, but in fact clouding the identity even further, proving Chris Merritt's point on the difficulty of tracking individually. But the census data is important. I want to get past that and look at them as more than just Qi or just a Chinaman from 1870, quote unquote. This gentleman is from a document that we'll look at later on. He looks to me to be capable of deep thought. I want to know what's on his mind. I want to know his hopes, his dreams, his experiences, who he partnered with. Did he partner with only Chinese people, or were there cross-cultural connections in his time in Montana? What did he think? What were his obstacles to achieving his goals? What successes did he have? He seems capable of deep thought that sometimes is clouded because of the biased nature of the source material that comes to us. And what we know is that Montana's Chinese were complex, intertwined with global affairs. So we have to figure out what sources can help us know this gentleman more fully and answer those questions on the top left, his hopes, his dreams, his experiences. Here's the overall numbers for the population of Chinese in Montana as it transitioned from a territory into statehood. And these are important documents. This is not something that I just want to brush aside here. In 1870, the population was at its highest percentage. That number of almost 1,950 Chinese in the territory of Montana represented 10% of Montana's population at that time. We also know that the Chinese were historically, traditionally undercounted in census representation. So it might have been as much as 10 to 15% of Montana's population in 1870. In China here, I'm sorry, in Helena, here, my present hometown, the Chinese population was 21% of Helena in 1870. So considerable, impactful part of Montana's early history. Numerically, it was at its peak. The Chinese population was at its peak in 1890. With 2,500 Chinese spread across the state. And then we see a dramatic decline that we'll talk about. But we need to break these numbers apart even further. I see many of you in the chat indicated that you're from Missoula, and we're hosted by the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. So I wanted to look more closely at this. This is a small chart. Yeah, I know you probably can't see everything here, but these are all Montana's counties and the Chinese population of each county from 1870, 1880 on through 1930. To help us look more closely at our host city here, here's Missoula County. Now, I want to be careful. This is not Missoula City. This is the population of Missoula County. 93 Chinese in Missoula County in 1870. And you'll see its peak in 1890 of 405 Chinese in Missoula County, with a dramatic decline over the next 10 years, with only 113 in Missoula County in 1900. And so we ask ourselves, what accounts for this decline? And that's what I'll ask you at this point in time. What accounts for this decline of the Chinese? Oh, I'm going to launch this. I'm going to try to do that again. Should be our last poll. Okay, why did the Chinese leave Montana? Maybe not Missoula County specifically, but Montana. They never intended to stay. They were forced out by violence and intimidation. There were not many Chinese women, and so it made family development difficult, and then moved on to precious metal strikes in other parts of the North American West. It seems like many of you think they were forced out by violence and intimidation. They never intended to stay, gets 4 votes. The absence of Chinese women made family development difficult. These are indeed correct. They moved on to precious metal strikes in other areas. I don't really see that in the sources. There were precious metal strikes in 1877 out in the Dakotas, but I didn't really see Montana's Chinese going out to take advantage of those things. And so you're asking the right questions. Actually, it's a bit of a trick question because this doesn't have anything to do with the Chinese themselves. Okay. When we look at this, what we see is that it's got to do more with Montana politics than it does with anything related to the Chinese. So yes, Missoula's population went from 405, Missoula County went from 405 in 1890 to 113 in 1900. But if you look at, here's a map of Missoula County as per the 1890 census. Things changed in 1893 when that one county was broken up in this way. So what had been one county of Missoula County now became 5 parts of different counties. Missoula, Flathead, Granite, Ravalli, and Teton County were all created in 1893. And you see that, simply put, some of the Chinese, the border moved, the county border moved and found them in different areas. So 55 in Flathead County, 30 in Ravalli County. And so that's the point of having to understand the Montana broader context. It can be misleading to just look at 405 in Missoula County in 1890, only 113 in 1900. Something violent must have happened. That's not necessarily the case. But there definitely was a decline. For most of these counties, there was a decline of the Chinese from 1890 to 1900. Maybe some of you who have some understanding of Chinese American history will think it's because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And as its name implies, it's trying to stop Chinese from coming in. Maybe that led to a decline of the Chinese already within the state. That happened in 1882. And actually, Montana saw an increase in its Chinese population from 1880 to 1890 when the Chinese Exclusion Act took place. Nationally, the Chinese population stayed quite static even during the Chinese Exclusion Act. In Montana, it grew. So that's not the answer. There was a reaffirmation of this in 1888 with the Scott Act that tried to give a little bit more teeth to the Chinese Exclusion Act and actually stop Chinese who had legally entered the country and visited family back in China, try to stop them from re-entering the United States. But that's 1888. That couldn't possibly account for this decline. There is a reason in terms of the anti-Chinese legislation, and here we have a very famous Montanan talking about this. This is Montana Senator Wilbur Fisk Sanders in 1892. He says it's not desirable that these people, the Chinese, shall be multiplied in this country, but that they shall be diminished to extinction. Those are strong words. Diminished to extinction. It didn't actually manifest in totality, but the spirit of Sanders' point from 1892 did become a reality in 1930, 40, 50, as Montana's once large Chinese population dwindled to around 200 total in 1950. So as I looked into these sources and tried to figure out what remains from the Chinese experience in Montana, random scraps of the story emerged. Here we see the Committee of the Chinese Empire Reform Association of Marysville, Montana. Interesting. I want to know more about what they're trying to reform. What's this Chinese empire? Why Marysville, Montana? Is it only these 5 gentlemen? So questions emerge. We see news about deportations of the Chinese in Helena. We see one gentleman from Billings talking about how the American man has made the Chinese man go back home when the Chinese man believes he has a right to stay, but the Chinese man will go home and boycott American goods and tell the people of China how he was treated here. And this is interesting. What's this talking about? Has a right to stay, deportation, and then this boycott. So these are interesting things. For my purposes, this was the most, maybe not the most visually interesting of these sources, but the most interesting source. This is the special census of the Chinese in Montana, Idaho region in 1905. And I'm going to linger on this for quite a while here. Jesse and Ann, have there been any questions that we need to deal with before I move on?
We actually just got one in asking, did the 1909 Muffley Bill play much role in the decline of the population?
I'm not aware of that bill. Is that the Anti-Miscegenation Act, which did not allow Chinese to marry outside of the group of Chinese?
Yes.
Yeah. It didn't cause its decline. What it did cause is a cessation of further growth. Okay, so in 1909, there was this Anti-Miscegenation Act, which made it impossible for the Chinese to marry outside of the race or ethnicity of other Chinese. And there simply put were not many Chinese women in Montana at the time. And so it made it difficult for family formation. That law was enacted until 1953. And so some people would say, well, the Chinese had a cultural prohibition against their women coming over to migrate. That's not untrue, but also American laws very specifically tried to prohibit Chinese women from being allowed in. And so that did definitely lead to the back end of that decline. Good question, good question. So this special census of Montana, Chinese in Montana and the Idaho region in 1905, I came across this and was just fascinated by this. What is a special census? Why just the Chinese? Why 1905? Why this region? And I looked out there to see, is there any other work by historians that's been done on this special census? And there's not much. In fact, Marion Smith, historian for Immigration Services, said the results of the 05 Chinese census, including statistical data for the nation and individual enumerations for some states, remain buried in the segregated Chinese files. A colleague of mine made me aware of this census that resides in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. So I thought to myself, well, it's 199 pages. It looks like it's a gold mine. I better get myself out to Washington, D.C. and see what this shows. Trying to fund that, trying to figure out how to get out there and do that with my other obligations. And then I thought, I'll just check down the street here at the Montana Historical Society, and they had it all on microfilm. Well, I spent several weeks transcribing everything that I could from this source and listening to try and figure out what this source was telling me. So this special census, I found 2,283 names with multiple categories of data. And the government agents who took this census were accompanied by a Chinese interpreter, Moi Donqing. And so the names that we see here are much more likely to be the actual individual identity of those Chinese men and women populating the state of Montana in 1905. That was an exciting find. Took a lot of work to get to a place where I could interpret that. And so here it's a little bit more visually accessible of a document. But here you see the individuals alphabetized, the location at their time of registration, okay? This Gary Act certificate number, we'll talk more about what that is. When they registered for this Gary Act, we'll talk about that. And then where they were found during the special census in 1905 and what their occupation was. Now, I want to be clear. This is not a census in terms of something that happens every 10 years for demographic collection of data. This was much more of a document check, a roust, almost an ice raid in 1905. This was checking to make sure that they have papers that had been required about a decade earlier. Very specifically focused just on the Chinese. Again, a raid of these populations across the state. And so I stepped back and tried to ask myself, how could I break this apart to try and listen to what this was telling me for more information on the Chinese experience in Montana and the United States. Here we see, again, location at the time of registration, Deadwood, South Dakota, and then in 05, Whitefish, Montana, Umatilla, Oregon, and then in 1905, Plains, Montana. So we see a lot of movement. I thought maybe I'll look at this geographically. Where were they in 1894 versus then winding up in Montana in 1905? And this was interesting. I thought it showed a lot of continuity for Montana's Chinese staying pretty much in place in the state. 729 of them who were found in 1905 had also been there in 1894. I thought that was interesting. And then I looked more specifically across the state at where they were found, and there's some interesting things to note from that. But what I really wanted to look at is, what is this Gary Act? It says the Gary Act certificate number and the date of registration. And so doing a little bit of research, it shows that this is part of an ongoing continuity of anti-Chinese legislation. That it started in 1875 with the Page Act, which, to the questioner's point, tried to limit the number of Chinese women who were being admitted. Basically, the Page Act assumed that any Chinese woman coming into the United States or attempting to come in was a prostitute. And so it tried to limit them because of these illicit means and the illicit means of supporting oneself. And so this very restricted the gender balance that could have been achieved in Chinese communities in the North American West. That was strengthened with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Didn't exclude all Chinese. Chinese workers, Chinese laborers were targeted by this. But if you were a merchant, a student, a diplomat, a traveler of a certain class, then you could still come in. But it was an attempt to try and exclude Chinese workers. Strengthened, as I mentioned, with the 1888 Scott Act, and then this 1892 Gary Act. On the 10-year anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act, it needed to be reaffirmed, and it was with the Gary Act. What the Gary Act did that was different from the Chinese Exclusion Act, exclusion had been at the borders. The Gary Act was for the interior. The Gary Act required all Chinese laborers to register with the state and have this certificate on them at all times. This certificate is for a man named Li Samfong, who was a real estate owner in Helena, Montana. They had to register two of these documents, one with the state and one on their person at all times. If they were found out of compliance with this, they could be arrested and deported without due process, without access to attorneys, without the basic parts of constitutional protections that it seems like everybody in America, citizen or not, should have. And so the Gary Act was much stronger action against the Chinese already in the United States. Many of these Chinese had been here since the 1860s when they'd been invited in to work on the railroads, and now all of a sudden their very presence in the United States became illegal. And so it tried to move from exclusion at the borders to expulsion from the interior. It required that they register in 1892, March 1892. And so as I broke apart that special census of 1905, which was a document check to make sure that they had registered in 1892, I found some interesting things. When did Montana's Chinese register? You would assume before March 1892. That wasn't the case at all. The data, as I broke it apart, showed that Montana's Chinese, for the most part, registered in 1894. Well, the source is trying to tell us something there. There's a story to be unraveled with that source and the information coming. As I broke it down even further, almost 40% of those who appeared on that census registered within the same month, 28% within the same week, and this visual representation shows us the vast majority of those who registered on the same day. May 3rd, 1894. Again, listening, trying to figure out what is this source telling me? What is this source allowing me to assert? What we find is that the people in charge of registering the Chinese were surprised at this. It seems that the Chinese had actively chosen to not register out of a disagreement with this act and its dictates. They felt like they had a legitimate reason to be here. They had followed the laws to this point. Now all of a sudden their presence had been made illegal, and they needed to register in ways that only criminals had registered before. So they actively chose to not comply in a concerted effort. Some of the anti-Chinese forces, I'm sorry, this picture is a little bit grainy, were happy that the Chinese were not complying. They wanted Uncle Sam, caricatured here, to kick out the Chinese person there after the May 3rd deadline to register in 1894 had come and gone. So the Gary Act had been fought. They hadn't registered. 2 years later, when they were forced to, they did at the very last moment. What we see is agency, voice, activism of Montana's Chinese by choosing to not comply until the very last moment. And we see their hopes and dreams and obstacles and goals, even though we don't have much of their own voices, that choice that they made to resist the Gary Act and its McCrary Amendment shows us some activism. Well, were there consequences to not registering or dragging one's feet or being out of compliance? This is a list of the arrests and deportations of Montana's Chinese. So from that census, then I looked for more information of how many Chinese were arrested and deported. And you can see after 1894, there's not many, just a handful arrested here and there. Even though we know that many of them were out of compliance, why wasn't this enacted? Well, the data begins to show us something different. In 1904, 1905, the arrests and deportations of Montana's Chinese spike, and vigorous action against the state's Chinese ensues. On a more broad national level, we see these are images of Montana's Chinese being arrested and deported, and headlines of their arrests and deportations. This gentleman here, Qing Yik, was found in Havre, found out of compliance with the Gary Act, was arrested and deported all within the span of less than a month, with very little access to legal representation to fight for his what he believed was his right to stay. Nationally, the number of Chinese arriving to try and immigrate into San Francisco, Port Townsend, Seattle, into America at these ports of entry, you know, it fluctuates as we go throughout the 1890s and early 20th century. What's really interesting, though, is not the number of arrivals, but the number of rejections. And so we see a spike in, again, 1904, 1905, of the percent of Chinese who were trying to migrate to the United States being rejected at those ports and border entry points. And so this is telling us something. What we find is that there was a change in national kind of purview of who was in charge of the Chinese question, and enforcement of the Gary Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act moved from under the Treasury Bureau to the newly created Bureau of Immigration in 1903. Not only was that change made, but then it was funded. And so with funding, the Bureau of Immigration took vigorous action at the ports of entry, but also in the interior. And raids against Montana's Chinese and Chinese across the the American West ensued from that change of 03 into 04. Montana's Chinese population declined largely because of this. And so Senator Wilbur Fisk Sanders, as he said, he wanted to diminish this population to extinction. Sadly, for the Chinese population of Montana and for the diversity of our state, that did become, for all intents and purposes, a reality as that Chinese Exclusion Act was strengthened by the Gary Act and finally enforced in 1904, 1905. And so that seems to be the end of the story, but something happened here. If that vigorous enforcement happened in 04, 05, why this drop-off then of arrests? Why this drop-off of deportations? Why this drop-off of rejections at the border? And here we have, again, a need to understand the Chinese experience in Montana in a broader lens. This gets pretty detailed into Chinese history here that we generally don't learn in our K through 12 education, but I think it's interesting and can help us understand Montana's Chinese more fully. Meanwhile, back in China, we have the context in China. This map of China shows Shanghai, where I live, Guangzhou, at the time called Canton, Hong Kong, Beijing. The vast majority of the Chinese who came to Montana were from the small county of Taishan, and they left poverty, drought, rebellions in this region, pushed out by those factors, but pulled by mining opportunities in California and the Rockies, and invited actually in 1868 to help build the railroads across the North American West with the Burlingame Treaty. So invited guests, invited workers, obviously that status would change. The Qing dynasty, the ruling dynasty in China from 1644 on, had its own troubles. And it was too weak to really protect itself from foreign incursion, let alone think about protecting its citizens abroad. And so unless the Qing dynasty could be strengthened, Chinese overseas had very little support from their motherland. The person in charge of the Qing dynasty is the Dowager Empress, pictured here on the right. But she was receding from control of China at this point in time. And her nephew, relation, the Guangxu Emperor to the bottom left, comes into power. She recedes from power, gives power over to him. He is the rightful emperor. And he, influenced by these two gentlemen to the bottom right, Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, institutes a modernization effort called the 100 Days of Reform. Kang and Liang convinced the Guangxu Emperor that China needs to strengthen, modernize, militarize, westernize if it's going to keep pace regionally and worldwide. It doesn't work. It's called the 100 Days of Reform because it only lasts for about 100 days. And then there is a conservative reaction. The Dowager Empress takes control again, throws the Guangxu Emperor into house arrest, and has all of the reformers that she can catch beheaded. Kang and Liang barely escape China with their heads on their shoulders and work to continue this reform effort from abroad. So here we get to that source I mentioned earlier, the Committee of the Chinese Empire Reform Association of Marysville, Montana. We see the Guangxu Emperor up here. We see these 5 gentlemen who are part of this committee. We see these battleships. Those of you who know Montana's geography know that Marysville, Montana is a great deep water port. I joke, it's a ghost town, a mining town just outside of Helena, but they're saying China must modernize, industrialize, westernize. Yeah, for the Guangxu emperor because he's the rightful emperor, but more so if China becomes a modern power, then China will be able to protect its citizens from harassment abroad. And they actually tried to establish a Chinese college in Billings and Butte. These reformers are very, very motivated. In Butte, Montana, they actually had a militia where they trained with live ammunition on the streets of Butte. Pretty astonishing for the when you consider how Chinese were treated in other parts of the West. And so they're motivated to try and strengthen their nation so that their protection would be strengthened. Across Montana, there were as many as 12 branches of the Chinese Empire Reform Association. Here you see the Butte branch, and they're motivated to try and make their nation stronger so that they could have a stronger protection. Here we see some of these individuals. Here's one of these gentlemen. We see choices being made. The style of dress that they have, is it going to be Eastern and Chinese, or are they going to modernize and become Western and more American? Even the style of hair choice, keeping the old Chinese queue, which was mandated by the Qing dynasty, or going over to a more westernized, modernized look here. We see assimilation happening before our eyes. But you might remember this gentleman from earlier, and I wanted to know his hopes and dreams and aspirations and obstacles. Well, we have them. His name was Hao Si, and he is the state lecturer for the Chinese Empire Reform Association who visits the societies in other cities. He's visited and spoken to all of them with the exception of the one in Missoula. His name is Hao Si, and he's present in the city of Chicago. He'll return in about 2 weeks and will then visit Missoula to continue these reform type efforts. So I found this quite interesting. We can get a sense of his hopes, his dreams, who he partnered with, what he did, how he tried to achieve his goals. Kang and Liang, living in exile, actually come to Montana. This is astonishing. These are two of the most brilliant Confucian scholars in modern Chinese history, and they come to Livingston, Montana. They come to Helena, they come to Butte, and they're quite impressed with the Chinese communities here in Montana. And so they try to activate these communities for their purposes. The Chinese had fought the Gary Act. They'd worked for new treaties. They'd worked to strengthen China. None of those things had worked. Kang in 1905 has an idea, and he tries to now fight mistreatment of the Chinese in the United States through economic means. This is where he institutes a global boycott of American goods. So wherever Chinese are found, if they stop purchasing American goods, maybe America will stop the harassment of Chinese citizens abroad. They lead this global boycott. And here you see it's a nuanced boycott, though. In June 1905, Kang states what this boycott's goals are. America's making a great mistake in adopting such stringent laws against the Chinese. Of course, these laws are passed to keep out our lower class of cheap labor, the Chinese workers. Kang didn't disagree with that at this point in time. But he says, however, the rigid enforcement of these laws excludes a desirable class of Chinese. Upper class people, businessmen, travelers, students ought to be treated with leniency. So it's not a boycott for all Chinese. At this point, it's only a boycott for the elite. Montanans did fear this boycott, though. We're not talking about Chinese Montanans now. We're talking about wheat farmers out in central and eastern Montana. Because in 1905, you can read the quote there. The 1905 wheat crop will make a new high record. It'll be the most phenomenally abundant crop years the United States has known. And so they were worried, if we've got this great wheat crop, but this newly opened China market is not buying wheat, because of this boycott, Montanans were indeed scared of what the economic repercussions might be. And so we see the Billings Gazette reporting that a steamer load of flour, Montana flour from its wheat, recently arrived at one of the Chinese ports, but no purchaser was found, although the flour was offered cheap. And the Lewistown Fergus County Argus says American trade with China has fallen off 95% because of this boycott. The Chinese are going into the Australian market instead for their flour, even though they're paying higher prices than for the American product. So you can see this, this boycott did have many Montanans scared. Liang Qichao reports from Shanghai, where he was leading this boycott. He'd been in Butte, he'd been in Helena, and then he went back to Shanghai. And he says all the foreigners are shook by this. They've become worried, saying that China, the sleeping lion, has awakened. Since the treaty ports were established, there's never been any activity like this. It shows that we Chinese are not easily bullied. But it must be remembered, at this point in time, the boycott was only advocating for elite Chinese, merchants, diplomats, scholars, students, travelers, not the working class that populated most of Montana's Chinese population. At this moment in time, though, Kang visits Montana in August and September of 2005. The boycott was on. He's advocating for better treatment of elite Chinese. When he comes to Montana, though, he sees the normal working class Chinese harassed, harried, rounded up, arrested, and deported because of that special census. And Kang actually begins to build some empathy for the working class Chinese because of his activism here in Montana. And so he sees people like Qichao in Billings. He's not a diplomat, not a student. He's a common laborer who had gained entry and now is feeling like he's being harassed unjustly. Qichao is arrested and ordered to be deported. The Billings Gazette gives us his words in a pidgin English, which I won't dignify, but instead Qichao says, "The American man makes the Chinese man go back home when the Chinese man believes he has a right to stay here. But the Chinese man will go home and boycott American goods and tell the Chinese people how he was treated here." So we see this brilliant Confucian scholar in Kang also interacting with people like Qichao, these ordinary workers, and Kang's mind is changed. Here's a handbill, one of the most fascinating sources I found from the Fort Benton River Press in Chinese, and it's indicating that people who don't support the boycott are cold-blooded animals like this turtle. So to see a propaganda document like this from China reported in Fort Benton's press, a town of 1,000 people and maybe 26 Chinese at this point in time, just showed the global reach of this boycott. Kang travels through Montana in August and September of 2005. He's interacting with ordinary workers who are harassed by the raids, by the arrests, by the deportations. In fact, when Liang traveled through in 1903 to when Kang traveled through in 1905, Montana's Chinese population had declined by 30%. Again, that's because of the arrests, the deportations, the harassment, and that's making manifest Senator Wilbur Fisk Sanders' goal to diminish this population to extinction. Kang gains empathy and actually changes the goal for the 1905 global boycott, and he advocates for common Chinese workers. In a letter to President Roosevelt, he references specifically the Gary Act and that special census that had just rocked Montana's Chinese population. He says Chinese are hunted down as illegally residing in this country due to exclusion laws, each harsher and more drastic than its predecessor, resulting in the employment of an army of officials to enforce their provisions. The Gary Law established the system of identification, rigid inspection, sudden arrest, imprisonment, and deportation of all whose only crime was a desire to earn a living like other people. The Chinese inspectors are invested with full power to break into houses and stores of Chinese suspects and to make arrests at all hours of the day and night. He had not been aware of this level of harassment of ordinary Chinese until he traveled through Montana in August and September and found a population that was empathetic with his cause, but also reeling from the arrests, the deportations, the harassment of that 1905 special census. President Theodore Roosevelt listens as Kang takes up the cause of all Chinese, not just the elite, and Roosevelt ends intrusive body exams that had been taking place at ports of entry of Chinese potential entrants. He ends that special census and roundups. It had already happened in Montana, but Roosevelt ends it for other places that it was slated to happen across the United States. And he transfers the most aggressive and anti-Chinese immigration officials away from ports where they would be dealing with the Chinese. So Kang and Montana's Chinese and this boycott did indeed have an impact. It didn't end Chinese exclusion. That would not end until 1943, but the treatment of the Chinese was indeed improved. And you can see from the statistics, after that 1905 boycott, we see a decline in arrests and deportations and also a decline in rejection at the ports and borders of entry. That's only possible if we understand the Chinese in Montana through a broader lens. And all of this originated, again, document detectives, originated with one source, that 1905 special census of the Chinese in Montana and Idaho. At this point in time, I've been talking at you for quite some time. I'd like to open it up for questions. I know I threw a lot of Chinese history at you, some Montana history that probably sounded familiar, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, what you'd like to know more about, or any connections you can make to that.
It looks like we have a question that just came in. Is written Cantonese the same as written Mandarin? And where did your translators come from for this project?
Good question. Let me share again for just a second. These are my translators. Let's see. So these are my translators. When I was working in Shanghai, I gathered together a number of students who had the necessary language ability. Now, what I found is that present day written Chinese in mainland China was not sufficient to unlock these documents. These were written in traditional script and in sometimes a hard to decipher calligraphy. So there are slight differences between written Cantonese and written Mandarin, but for the most part, the written language is the same. How it's verbalized is where the Chinese dialects come into differences. So what I had to do is find people who could read traditional Chinese writing. Most people in mainland China cannot, because after the communist victory in the 1940s and the Chinese Civil War, Mao Zedong and the communists simplified the Chinese written script to try and increase literacy. It worked, but it also divorced most Chinese today from an understanding of the historical writing script. So I had to find Chinese who could read the traditional script, and those were mostly my students and their families from Taiwan. And so I had a number of high school students who could read it. We had some Chinese teachers at the school who could read it, and then parents and grandparents. So it was a cross-generational project to try and translate these documents that are housed at the Montana Historical Society. Good question about the differences in the writing versus the verbalized language.
Our next question, this is from Brian, who says he read about how pleased President Roosevelt was with the demonstration at a Los Angeles parade. And I'm assuming, Brian, this is a demonstration of the Chinese. So he wants to know why President Roosevelt made those statements.
Yeah, Roosevelt, like any politician, they're complex. At times, some of the things that Roosevelt would say sounded quite racist and anti-Chinese. At other times, it seemed to be praising the Chinese. And so it kind of depended on his audience. Kind of an attitude follows latitude type approach. Where he would speak to the audience in that sense. And if he's speaking to a population out in Los Angeles or California or something like that, he might have been more praiseworthy. In fact, during this time period, many Chinese had been expelled from California, Oregon, Washington. But then one of the constant problems in the American West is a labor shortage. After expelling those Chinese, they needed people to fill those vacancies. So we saw a lot of business owners pleading with President Roosevelt to lessen Chinese exclusion so that Chinese could come in and take these jobs. So it probably had to do with the audience that he addressed at that point in time when he's witnessing that Chinese parade.
Have another one. Thank you for the spectacular presentation, which I definitely agree with. Can you talk a bit about Chinese women in Montana? Do you see activism of any kind in their part, or of any kind on their part in the sources?
Good question. In other parts of the North American West, there were Chinese Empire Reform Associations that had women involved. In Montana, I have not found that to be the case. And I didn't find much in terms of Chinese women activism on this topic that I talked about today, the special census, the boycott, and things like that. Simply put, their numbers were minuscule compared to the overall Chinese population in Montana. We're talking about 128 Chinese women spread across the state in one count at one point in time, and those numbers dipped. What I found later on is the difficulty of family formation, and I do have some work that I'm doing on trying to tell the history of the experience of Chinese women in the state, but for the most part, they were here in such small numbers, again, partially because of Chinese cultural preference for men to be sent out for work, but more so because of American laws that tried to intentionally restrict Chinese women from coming in, so as to intentionally restrict Chinese families from taking root. So we do have some Chinese women's stories in the later 20th century, but nothing related to this moment of activism.
I have a question specifically about the sources. Is there any way to filter out any truth from the biased US newspaper reports?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. The non-Chinese newspapers who reported on the Chinese population in Montana have their biases. And if you stopped at that, you would only get that perspective. This is what we call corroboration. So if I have one newspaper that's not from a Chinese perspective, but reports on a Chinese event, I then have to corroborate and check that against other sources, possibly other sources, or at least an understanding of Chinese culture. Where this becomes most apparent is with non-Chinese newspapers' coverage of, for instance, Chinese funerals. There, throughout Montana's newspapers, we hear of these strange, quote unquote, strange funeral practices. One of the newspapers says this Chinese man was buried with all the mystic rites of the Orient. And if you just stopped at what the non-Chinese reporters reported to us about these Chinese funeral practices, it would be indecipherable. It would seem exotic and strange, and it would further distance our understanding of the Chinese Montanans' experience. So instead, what I had to do is take these non-Chinese newspaper accounts and corroborate them against a deep understanding, I hope, of Chinese cultural practices, and then begin to read them together. So you're right, if we stopped at the biased perspective from non-Chinese newspaper sources, it would not give an authentic perception of the Chinese experience in Montana.
We have a question asking, can you tell us about the special prison near San Francisco?
Yes, I imagine that's Angel Island Immigration Station. I think that's probably what the questioner is asking about. Yeah, oftentimes Angel Island is given as a shorthand of, oh, it's like an Ellis Island, but for the West Coast. It wasn't like that at all. Ellis Island out in New York Harbor was quite welcoming to immigrants seeking to come in, with the exception of anybody with health concerns. So the main point of Ellis Island was to try and scan for contagious diseases and people with contagious diseases from coming into the nation. And I know that there are stories of kind of a harsh experience and an alien experience coming through this foreign, into this foreign culture of immigrants from Europe. Angel Island was much more specifically trying to exclude and enact Chinese exclusion against potential Asian immigrants. So it was not a friendly place for Chinese who were trying to come into the nation, thought that they had a right to come into the nation. One of my later chapters in what I hope is my forthcoming book about this is about a young man who comes to Seattle in 1933. And he is of Chinese ethnicity, but he's an American citizen. He has a right to enter and is eventually granted entry into the United States, recognized as a citizen, only after 6 weeks of detention and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of questions with a level of minute detail that was designed to try and stop Chinese from getting entry to the United States. That's up in Seattle. The same went down for Angel Island, a harsh, intimidating, cold place out of intention to try and limit the number of Chinese who were allowed into the United States.
And then the final question that we have now, although if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to keep typing them in. Were there many acts of mob violence aimed at expelling Chinese from Montana town?
It's a good question. And what I find is that for the most part, there was not. We know down in Wyoming, there was the 1885 Rock Springs massacre, which killed more than 30 Chinese. In the border of Idaho and Oregon, there's a massacre in 1887. There was violence against the Chinese out in Tacoma, out in Los Angeles. Thankfully, in Montana, there were not instances of large mob type violence against Chinese communities. That's not to say that the Chinese here were welcomed, but there simply was not the one moment of massacre or forced expulsion that we see elsewhere. I don't really know exactly why that is the case. There was certainly a lot of racist rhetoric. There was a lot of talk about the Chinese must go. There were certainly murders of certain individuals and harassment of individuals, but not the one iconic, thankfully, not the one iconic Rock Springs type massacre of 1885. It's not that the Chinese were here in any lesser numbers than in Wyoming or Idaho or those other areas. So I'm not exactly sure what accounted for that. It might have been, you know, that Rock Springs massacre, which happened in the fall of 1885, had repercussions, and anti-Chinese forces here in Montana might have looked at those repercussions and thought better against taking mob action against the Montana's Chinese. But as you saw Senator Wilbur Fisk Sanders' statements about the Chinese must be diminished to extinction, that threat of violence was always simmering just underneath the surface. So it's not as if Montana's Chinese settled in and ever felt terribly at home and comfortable and free from threat here.
Wow, thank you so much, Mark. That was an amazing presentation. And thank you to everyone who has tuned in today to Document Detective lecture number 1 and the great questions that have been asked. This was really enlightening, and thank you so much. For everyone who is here, definitely you have our emails or our links. Tune in. Our next presentation will be by Greg Martin, and that is the 25th of May at 1 p.m. Also, we'll be doing a Zoom webinar about the history of the African American community in Missoula and Montana. So we're very excited to bring that to you in our next segment of Document Detectives. This is a powerful thing that we are able to do now with this great Zoom capability where people can follow along and be part of these presentations from all over the country. So very fascinating. Thank you, Mark. And for anyone who would like to support future programs like these, then please tune in to our upcoming next week large community-wide giving day. I'm putting the link in the chat. That is Missoula Gives. It's also statewide through Montana. It's May 6th and 7th, and it is an amazing way to support the nonprofits and organizations like the Historical Museum and many other great organizations out there during Missoula Gives, Montana Gives, May 6th and 7th. Definitely pin that link on your page and mark your calendar and help support all the nonprofits that do great things and future programs like this at the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. So thank you again for everything. Thank you for being here. We'll go through real quick. There's just a few, everyone's enjoying the presentation. Why are these at 1 p.m., Carla? It's so hard to figure out the best time to have a Zoom, and we thought hopefully that right after lunch was a good time to do it. All of these recordings will be available on our website, which I will also put in the link there, so you can tune back in or share with your friends and family members. These recordings, will get them up hopefully by the end of the week on each session. So go ahead and share them or come back and watch it again at your leisure. And we also had one quick question, Mark, about when do you think your book will be published?
I just want to say thank you, Anne. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you to the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula and everybody taking time out of your day to be here. I hope you can tell that I like talking about this stuff. I think it's interesting. It's pretty in depth. I put my email address in there in case you'd like to be in touch. If you have any expertise on this or want to follow up, please feel free. I'd love to partner with anybody who's interested in this. I hope the book to be out at latest by maybe September 2022. It's a pretty long process. So this covers a couple of touches on a couple of the chapters that I'm working on, but I just love doing this work. Happy to have partners like Jesse and Ann. Thank you.
Thank you again, Mark. Who knows, maybe we'll be back doing a Document Detectives with you again come fall. So stay tuned, everyone. Watch our website. I'll be sending stuff out soon. And thank you again for tuning in. Have a lovely day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.